Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are unpacking a highly specific, incredibly dense blueprint from a blog called Barack Face.
It is definitely dense.
Right. And the mission of today's conversation is to really explore this massive roadmap for the complete economic and industrial resurrection of an entire region. We're talking about West Bengal, India.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating case study because we are looking at a total reimagining of what a 21st century economic model actually looks like.
Exactly. Moving far beyond the standard idea of, just throwing up a few factories, cutting a ribbon, and calling it a day.
The stakes here are just massive when you look at the historical context. Bengal was once the undisputed industrial nerve center of the subcontinent.
It really was.
Yeah, it held the manufacturing dominance. It had the major ports, the heavy engineering base. But over the decades, it faced a really severe historical decline.
Right. The manufacturing share dropped, traditional industries stagnated.
Exactly. And that economic prominence just faded away. So the goal of the roadmap we are analyzing today is to reclaim that powerhouse status.
But crucially, the source argues this cannot be achieved through nostalgia or by trying to, recreate the 1950s.
Oh, absolutely not. It proposes a radical systemic pivot to future-proof the economy from the literal dirt up.
So whether you're an entrepreneur looking for the mechanics of emerging markets or a policy nerd who loves a comprehensive master plan, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, or even if you are just someone fascinated by how massive, complex systems interconnect.
Right, because this is a masterclass in how to rebuild an economy. It proves that true innovation isn't always inventing a new app.
No, sometimes it's looking at an old system and completely rewiring its fundamental logic.
Yeah. And to start that rewiring, the source insists we have to completely change our definition of what an industry actually is. The core argument here is that for Bengal, the new steel is food.
I love that phrase. And that paradigm shift forms the absolute bedrock of this entire blueprint.
It's a huge shift.
It demands a complete departure from how agriculture is traditionally viewed in developing economies.
Because usually we treat agriculture like a low productivity commodity, right? It operates almost like selling raw crude oil.
Exactly. You pump it, you sell it raw, the margins are razor thin.
And you're entirely at the mercy of global price fluctuations. But this roadmap says agriculture needs to be treated like a pipeline industry.
Yeah, akin to semiconductors or cloud computing.
Which is wild. My immediate question when reading this was, how does a cabbage become as economically powerful as a microchip?
Well, the answer lies in escaping what the author calls the commodity trap.
Okay, break that down for us.
So currently, the vast majority of farmers operate under a brutal set of constraints. They produce raw, undifferentiated crops.
Right.
And they lack meaningful storage infrastructure. The transportation networks to get their yield to lucrative markets are fragmented, and honestly, they're agonizingly slow.
Because of that, the spoilage rate has to be catastrophic.
Oh, it is. The farmer is forced into a panic sales situation. They end up offloading the crop to local middlemen for pennies on the dollar.
Simply because a cabbage rotting in a field has a value of exactly zero.
Right. So the farmer performs the most back-breaking physical labor for the lowest conceivable financial return.
They're essentially racing to the bottom on price because, at the end of the day, a potato is just a potato.
Exactly. If thousands of farmers are harvesting potatoes on the exact same week, the oversupply just completely crushes the value.
So what's the alternative?
The alternative proposed here is modern agriculture structured as an integrated industrial chain. It mirrors the complexity of electronics manufacturing.
Okay, so the value chain doesn't start at the harvest?
No, it starts with high-tech input manufacturing, like producing advanced bio-fertilizers. Then you have the optimized production on the farm itself.
And the moment that crop is harvested, it enters an unbroken pipeline.
Yes. Immediate cold storage, sophisticated processing, specialized packaging, then global certification, streamlined logistics, and finally, export distribution.
So the farmer transforms from the tragic end of a broken line into a highly valued supplier. They're feeding a high-margin global machine.
Precisely. Processing that raw potato into export-grade frozen fries changes everything.
Or, certifying that cabbage as premium organic and air freighting it to a luxury supermarket in Dubai. The profit margins explode.
The objective is to elevate agriculture so that it generates service sector level returns.
Because you are capturing the compounding value of the entire supply chain rather than just the initial raw material.
Yeah. But to achieve that, you need massive geographic leverage. And the source points out that eastern India, and Bengal specifically, is sitting on an underpriced geographic jackpot.
A jackpot for this exact pipeline model, right?
Exactly. The natural water abundance of the Gangetic Plains is a massive structural advantage.
Because intensive cultivation there is naturally supported. You're sidestepping the need for those multi-billion-dollar energy-intensive irrigation mega projects that arid regions need.
Right. And the climate diversity is even more striking. The roadmap maps out a tiny geographic radius, just a few hundred kilometers.
And it contains entirely different climatic worlds.
Yeah. You have Himalayan cold climate crops up in Sikkim. They're producing premium teas, niche herbs, organic spices.
And then just a short distance south in North Bengal, the climate shifts completely.
It shifts to temperate horticulture,
Mm.
perfect for pineapples, lychees, and oranges.
Then you move further south into the river basins of Bihar and Bengal, and you have massive staple crop production.
And finally, down in the Sundarbans, you hit tropical delta farming.
That is just incredible. The economic implication of that diversity has to be staggering.
It really is. Because global supply chains absolutely despise seasonality.
Right. A major international supermarket chain wants a reliable supplier every single month of the year.
Exactly. And this specific microclimatic stacking allows the region to build year-round export capacity.
So you aren't paralyzed when the potato season ends because the pineapple season is peaking or the high-altitude spices are ready for harvest.
You get a constant diversified stream of high-value produce maturing on a staggered schedule.
But all of that staggered high-value output needs a funnel. And the source frames Kolkata as that ultimate geopolitical funnel.
It really challenges the perception of Kolkata as merely a cultural or administrative capital.
Yeah, it redefines it as an underused geopolitical gateway. It sits right at the edge of the Indo-Pacific.
Acting as a port gateway into Southeast Asia, the Bay of Bengal trade system, and the Middle East.
So if food is the new steel, Kolkata is basically the Rotterdam of Eastern agriculture. It's the hyper-efficient export machine shipping that steel to the world.
But acknowledging that potential immediately highlights the biggest friction point in the whole plan.
Which is?
You cannot operate a modern pipeline industry without the physical pipes. A highly diversified agricultural yield is totally useless if it degrades before it reaches a buyer.
Which brings us to the second major pillar of this blueprint, the infrastructure of freshness. The source identifies the true antagonist in this economic narrative.
Yeah, and the enemy isn't a lack of farmer work ethic or poor soil productivity.
The enemy is time.
Exactly. It is the thermodynamic reality of spoilage. We are looking at a regional system where an astronomical percentage of fruits and vegetables simply rots on the side of a highway.
It's tragic. The roadmap's solution is something it calls a time machine for vegetables. We are talking about the Eastern Agri-Logistics superhighway.
I mean, to grasp the necessity of this superhighway, we have to look at the broken links in the current transit system.
Break it down for us. What does it look like right now?
Right now, cold chain infrastructure lacks any meaningful scale. You might find an isolated cold storage warehouse here or there.
But it's not connected to an integrated, temperature-controlled transit grid?
No, not at all. Trucks carrying perishable goods are frequently delayed on inconsistent road networks.
And the energy grid required to maintain an unbroken cold chain on a truck in 100-degree heat is incredibly demanding.
Failures are just incredibly common, and the result is total value destruction.
So a buyer in Singapore might desperately want those premium pineapples from North Bengal, but if the logistical network cannot deliver them in pristine condition, the demand is completely irrelevant.
Exactly. So the crown jewel of the roadmap solution is the Agri-Rail Express.
Dedicated refrigerated trains.
Yes, and the impact of refrigerated rail operates on 4 distinct pillars. Extending shelf life is the foundational benefit.
Because by dropping the core temperature of the produce immediately after harvest and maintaining it during transit, you're literally pausing the biological degradation clock.
Right. Now, the second pillar seems to be the most critical for capturing those high-margin international contracts.
Predictable delivery.
Yes. If I am running a massive grocery chain in the UAE, the absolute quality of the produce is actually secondary to the reliability of the delivery.
Because if the shipment arrives on a Thursday when I scheduled the shelf space for a Tuesday, I haven't just lost the produce.
No, you've lost the revenue for that retail square footage for the entire week. Predictability is the only thing a global buyer will bank on.
And the global market is entirely unforgiving regarding unreliability.
Oh, absolutely. Which leads to the third pillar, Refrigerated rail solves the scale issue through bulk aggregation.
Right. A train allows you to move thousands of tons of produce simultaneously. You completely bypass the fragmentation of 1,000 individual trucks navigating awful traffic.
And that massive scale directly enables the fourth pillar, a drastic reduction in the logistics cost per kilo.
It makes long-distance export economically viable by just crushing the overhead transit costs.
The physical mapping of this network is detailed in what the source calls the Kolkata Food Belt Plan.
It envisions the entire region cutting across state lines as a single interconnected agricultural organism.
Yeah. You pull organic vegetables and premium tea from Sikkim. You aggregate fish and horticulture from North Bengal.
You funnel in high-altitude herbs from Nepal, booming global superfoods like makhana from Bihar, and potatoes and dairy from UP.
But you can't just toss all of this onto a chilled train car and hope for the best.
No, the plan demands aggregation hubs in strategic locations like Siliguri, Malda, and Bardhaman.
And those hubs act as the industrial processing checkpoints. They aren't just massive refrigerators.
The raw harvest enters these hubs and undergoes rigorous grading and sorting.
Because global retail demands visual and qualitative uniformity. Every apple in a premium export crate must be virtually identical in size and blemish-free.
The hubs also handle specialized food-grade export packaging, and most critically, they execute phytosanitary testing.
We really need to pause on phytosanitary testing. The source stresses how catastrophic it is to skip this step.
Yeah, it describes it as a matter of life or death for an export business.
Because phytosanitary testing ensures the produce is entirely free of microscopic pests, fungal infections, and diseases.
And that it complies with the specific chemical residue limits of the importing nation.
Right. If a shipment reaches a port in Europe or the Middle East and fails a spot inspection, the entire cargo is rejected.
The exporter faces massive demurrage charges at the port, the total loss of the cargo's value, and severe reputational damage.
You can easily be blacklisted from future contracts. Testing at the source hub eliminates that terminal risk entirely.
So once that perfectly chilled, tested, and uniformly packaged produce reaches the port, the roadmap targets two specific global destinations to anchor the export strategy.
Dubai and Singapore.
The strategic logic behind those two targets is highly calculated, right?
Extremely. The UAE possesses massive purchasing power, coupled with an extreme dependency on food imports due to its arid geography.
Plus, there is a massive South Asian diaspora that already holds a cultural preference for these specific regional crops.
Exactly. They are willing to pay a heavy premium for certified organic produce. And Dubai serves as the premier logistical distribution node for the broader Middle East and African markets.
Okay, but Singapore plays a different strategic role. It's a smaller overall market.
It is, but it maintains some of the most stringent, uncompromising import standards on the planet.
So capturing the Singapore market is really about acquiring global credibility.
Yes, if your supply chain is robust, sanitary, and reliable enough to pass Singapore's regulatory gauntlet, you have essentially acquired a gold standard certification.
Satisfies Singapore, and you can confidently approach buyers in Tokyo, London, or LA.
It forces the regional infrastructure to operate at the absolute highest global standard.
Okay, so we have the conceptual framework. We have the high-value crops, the dedicated refrigerated rail lines, the aggregation hubs, and the strategic export targets.
But there is a massive catch.
Right, because transitioning millions of farmers away from chemical-heavy agriculture sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is.
If I am pushing back on this blueprint, I have to ask about the transition risk. You can't pump premium organic food into a state-of-the-art cold chain if the ground producing it is biologically dead from decades of chemical abuse.
That is the most profound vulnerability of modern agriculture.
If yields collapse during the transition, you don't get an economic miracle, you get mass starvation.
And the roadmap addresses it head-on in its third major section, Regenerating Soil as an Industry. The source is exceptionally clear-eyed about the dangers of a poorly managed transition.
When I think of organic farming, I tend to picture small boutique operations. A return to nature, using fewer inputs, maybe accepting lower yields for higher quality.
Sure, that's stereotype.
But the source refers to this as an industrial revolution. How can soil regeneration and organic farming operate as a heavy industry?
The source uses the neighboring state of Sikkim as the case study for this. Sikkim achieved a monumental civilizational milestone by becoming the first 100% organic state in the world.
Which is amazing.
It is. However, the blueprint analyzes the friction points of that transition. It notes that simply banning synthetic fertilizers without simultaneously providing a massive, highly scalable alternative supply chain of organic inputs is a recipe for yield collapse.
Because the soil has been artificially stimulated for decades,
Right.
right? Its natural microbial life is severely depleted.
Exactly. If you remove the synthetic nitrogen without replacing it, the plants literally starve.
So to scale the Sikkim model across the massive agricultural zones of Bengal requires what the source calls industrial muscle.
Organic farming can no longer be a boutique, localized ideology. It must become a hyperscalable manufacturing sector,
And this introduces the concept of fertility factories.
which is just a brilliant reframing of industrial potential. The roadmap suggests that Bengal's most lucrative near-term manufacturing opportunity isn't necessarily assembling automobiles.
It is manufacturing biological fertility.
Yes, we are looking at the mass production of biofertilizers, complex microbial inoculants, biochar blends, and advanced botanical pesticides.
Like concentrated neem extracts. So these aren't traditional farms, these are biotech facilities.
Completely. They operate with large-scale fermentation tanks, sophisticated laboratories, and precise chemical engineering protocols.
Instead of draining foreign exchange reserves to import millions of tons of synthetic chemical fertilizers, the region builds an entirely new domestic sector.
A sector that manufactures organic inputs at an industrial scale. It creates a massive, new vertical of employment while securing the agricultural supply chain.
This physical infrastructure supports the Bengal soil regeneration mission. And the roadmap pitches this not as a farming initiative, but as a statewide data-driven infrastructure megaproject.
The mechanics of that mission start with aggressive data collection.
Right. The plan calls for digital soil mapping down to the granular local block level.
They propose deploying fleets of mobile soil testing laboratories to analyze exactly which micro and macronutrients are depleted in specific fields.
Because you cannot engineer a biological recovery if you don't have a precise diagnostic map of the degradation.
Exactly. Armed with that data, the region executes a hybrid regenerative farming model.
And this directly addresses the transition risk we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, you avoid the catastrophic yield drops associated with overnight chemical bans. Instead, farmers enter a scientifically managed, multi-year step-down program.
They gradually reduce synthetic inputs by maybe 10 or 20% a year, while simultaneously injecting the exact microbial inoculants required to rebuild the soil.
The yields remain stable while the biological health of the dirt is aggressively restored.
The raw material required to feed these massive fertility factories brings us to an incredible systems-level connection.
It really does. The source points to the major urban centers. Cities like Kolkata, Asansol, and Siliguri generate thousands of tons of organic municipal waste every single day.
Currently, that waste is trucked to overflowing landfills, generating toxic runoff and massive methane emissions.
The blueprint calls this current model economic madness.
Because the perspective shift here is treating urban waste not as garbage, but as fertilizer feedstock.
The roadmap envisions building industrial-scale anaerobic digestion and composting megafacilities on the outskirts of these urban centers.
The city's organic waste is processed to extract biogas, which can be fed back into the urban energy grid.
And the nutrient-rich byproduct becomes the foundation for the liquid biofertilizers and compost supplied to the farming belt.
It is the ultimate circular economy. The cities provide the raw biological material to regenerate the farms, and the farms provide the high-yield, premium organic produce back to the cities and the export markets.
The waste crisis is literally monetized to solve the agricultural crisis.
And the financial implications of this regeneration go far beyond selling premium tomatoes. The source introduces a massive secondary revenue stream.
Climate finance.
Yes, healthy, biologically active soil is one of the most efficient carbon sinks on the planet. By regenerating millions of acres of degraded land, the region is actively sequestering millions of tons of atmospheric carbon.
And the math on that is staggering. As global carbon markets mature, that sequestration becomes a highly liquid financial asset.
The region unlocks access to green bonds, climate development finance from institutions like the World Bank, and direct corporate carbon credits.
The literal dirt becomes a measurable, appreciating capital asset on the state's balance sheet.
So, you have now established a deeply resilient foundation. You have a regenerated, massive organic agricultural engine.
You have the biotech fertility factory supplying it, and the Eastern Agri-Logistics superhighway moving the yield to global ports.
But the source emphasizes that while food might be the new steel, a modern economy still requires actual factories.
Right. Agriculture provides the base wealth, the environmental resilience, and the high-value exports, but it cannot single-handedly absorb the massive growing workforce.
To achieve sustained double-digit economic growth and true mass employment, you need a diversified manufacturing sector. So what does this 21st century factory look like?
Well, Bengal has a very deep industrial legacy: jute mills, tea estates, massive leather tanneries, and heavy steel plants.
Does the blueprint abandon these legacy sectors for shiny new tech?
It advocates the exact opposite. The strategy is to aggressively upgrade the legacy industries for the climate era.
Take jute, for example. Historically viewed as a sunset industry producing low-margin sackcloth.
Right, but the roadmap recontextualizes jute as a gold mine for the post-plastic economy.
Because as global regulations ruthlessly phase out single-use plastics, the demand for biodegradable alternatives is skyrocketing.
The transition involves moving jute out of basic textiles and into advanced material science.
We're talking about manufacturing high-end biodegradable retail packaging, developing jute-based thermal insulation materials for green construction,
And engineering advanced jute polymer composites that are lightweight and durable enough to replace plastic components in automobile interiors.
that is a massive pivot up the value chain. And the roadmap applies a similar logic to the textile industry.
It notes that neighboring Bangladesh has established an almost insurmountable dominance in low-end fast fashion garment manufacturing.
So engaging in a race to the bottom on labor wages to compete with Bangladesh would be economically destructive.
Completely. The blueprint mandates a pivot to technical textiles.
The thermodynamics and material science involved in producing fire-resistant uniforms for heavy industry, advanced medical and surgical textiles, or high-performance synthetic sportswear requires sophisticated, automated weaving and cutting systems.
It elevates the required skill level of the workforce and commands vastly superior profit margins.
The leather industry is another major legacy sector in Bengal, but historically it has been plagued by severe environmental degradation and toxic effluent runoff.
The proposed solution isn't to shutter the tanneries, but to aggressively consolidate them into clean leather clusters.
This involves centralized industrial zones equipped with state-of-the-art, hyper-efficient effluent treatment plants that guarantee zero liquid discharge.
And the economic logic here is entirely driven by global compliance.
If you can achieve certified green compliance, you are no longer selling cheap bulk leather to domestic markets.
Exactly. You gain access to the stringent European luxury markets, exporting high-end, sustainably sourced footwear and accessories.
The environmental upgrade basically pays for itself through premium market access.
Beyond upgrading the legacy sectors, the roadmap outlines entirely new engines of industrial growth.
The most critical is EMS electronics manufacturing services. The source provocatively labels electronics the new textile industry.
I found that comparison fascinating. It calls EMS the new textile because of its unparalleled capacity for labor absorption.
Right. The assembly of mobile phones, printed circuit boards, IoT sensors, and consumer electronics requires a massive, semi-skilled workforce.
The strategy is to leverage the region's high population density and proximity to the ports to build dedicated EMS corridors.
Serving as an alternative to the increasingly expensive manufacturing hubs in East Asia.
The energy transition is the other major growth engine.
The roadmap accepts the reality of the global shift toward electric vehicles and renewable energy, arguing that Bengal must position itself as a producer of this transition, not merely a consumer of imported technology.
And the approach here is highly pragmatic. It doesn't suggest throwing billions of dollars at building an entire EV brand from scratch to compete with established giants.
Instead, it focuses on the vital components. The region sets up facilities for assembling lithium-ion battery packs, manufacturing high-efficiency electric motors, and crucially, establishing massive battery recycling hubs.
As the first generation of EVs begins to age out globally, extracting and recycling the rare earth metals from spent batteries will become a massive, highly lucrative industrial sector.
The port city of Haldia plays a unique role in this energy strategy.
Given its existing deep-water port infrastructure and legacy petrochemical base, Haldia is perfectly positioned to pivot toward the green hydrogen and green ammonia economy.
It can serve as the import-export terminal for port-based hydrogen.
And the green ammonia produced there ties directly back into the agricultural sector, providing the base for clean, next-generation fertilizers.
Finally, the blueprint highlights pharma and biotech. Bengal possesses a very deep historical talent pool in science, engineering, and medical research.
The strategy is to aggressively expand generic drug manufacturing and vaccine production.
What is truly elegant about this is how the industrial ecosystems overlap. The highly specialized biotech infrastructure required for advanced pharmaceutical fermentation and vaccine production is essentially the same technological base required for the fertility factories we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The engineers designing microbial inoculants for the soil are utilizing the same underlying biotech principles as the teams formulating pharmaceuticals.
The industries reinforce each other's talent pools and supply chains.
It is a brilliantly unified industrial ecosystem.
But zooming out, the sheer scale of this wish list is overwhelming. You have high-speed refrigerated rail networks, massive biotech facilities, clean leather clusters, green ammonia ports, and statewide digital soil mapping.
It's a lot.
How does a region actually execute a master plan of this magnitude without it collapsing under its own bureaucratic weight?
Execution is everything, and the source provides a highly structured, phased timeline to prevent exactly that kind of systemic collapse.
It breaks the roadmap down into three distinct overlapping phases, recognizing that you cannot simply flip a switch and spawn an advanced economy overnight.
Let's walk through that timeline. If we are architecting this turnaround, what exactly is happening in Phase 1?
Phase 1 covers years 0 to 3, and it is entirely focused on foundations. You are not cutting ribbons on massive tech parks yet.
You are fixing the underlying plumbing of the economy.
This phase requires aggressive, uncompromising policy reform. It means implementing true single-window clearances.
Let's define what that actually means in a historically bureaucratic system.
A true single-window clearance means an entrepreneur doesn't spend 2 years bribing their way through 14 different municipal and state departments just to get an environmental permit and a power connection.
Right. It means a unified, digitized portal where a factory can get its land, power, water, and tax approvals simultaneously,
with legally mandated deadlines for the government to respond.
Removing that administrative friction is the primary goal of Phase 1.
Alongside policy reform, this phase initiates the soil regeneration mission, begins the digital mapping, and focuses heavily on doubling the region's existing, fragmented cold storage capacity.
The source projects that just by removing the bureaucratic bottlenecks and securing the initial agricultural yield, the region could see a 10 to 15% acceleration in GFDP growth.
Once that foundation is solid, you transition into Phase 2. Agri-transformation covering years 3 to 7.
This is where the heavy physical infrastructure is deployed.
The organic transition scales across the major farming belts. The dedicated agri-rail express networks are actually constructed and brought online.
The massive aggregation and agro-processing hubs in places like Malda and Bardaman begin churning out frozen foods, packaged juices, and tested export-ready produce.
The primary objective of Phase 2 is to have post-harvest spoilage losses and permanently double or triple farmer incomes,
generating massive capital liquidity within the rural economy.
That rural capital liquidity provides the domestic consumption base required for Phase 3, broad industrial revival.
Covering years 7 to 15 and beyond, this is the phase where heavy industry modernization truly accelerates.
The EMS corridors scale up to absorb millions of workers, the EV component manufacturing comes online, and the green ammonia ports become fully operational.
The ultimate goal is sustained, double-digit economic growth over a decade, permanently altering the trajectory of the region.
But the physical placement of these industries is just as critical as the timeline.
The roadmap explicitly warns against scattering factories randomly across the state. It mandates an ecosystem approach, clustering industries so they can share specialized logistics, power grids, and talent pools.
The spatial planning is divided into 3 primary industrial corridors.
Let's map those out. Corridor A connects the major urban center of Kolkata, the industrial hub of Howrah, and the deep-water port of Haldia.
Corridor A is the export manufacturing and high-tech belt. This is the epicenter for electronics manufacturing services, technical textiles, clean chemicals, and all port-linked logistics.
The roadmap relies on a powerful analogy here. Kolkata functions as Rotterdam, the sophisticated administrative, trading, and logistics brain of the operation,
while Haldia functions as Shenzhen, the dense, heavy-lifting manufacturing powerhouse.
Then you move inland to Corridor B, running through Durgapur, Asansol, and Bardaman.
Corridor B leverages the region's historical strength and heavy engineering. This is the heavy industry revival belt.
It is designated for the modernization of the steel industry, heavy machinery production, and the manufacturing of EV components like electric motors and battery recycling plants.
The energy-intensive industries are clustered here to optimize grid efficiency.
Finally, the map moves north to Corridor C, encompassing Siliguri and the broader North Bengal region.
Corridor C is the agro-industrial epicenter. It is the logistical anchor for the cold chain network, the primary site for the organic aggregation hubs, and the center for modernizing the tea, spice, and horticulture export industries.
Siliguri is positioned to become the undisputed logistics capital of the Eastern Himalayas.
The physical architecture of this plan is undeniably elegant. You have the heavy engineering core in the center, the advanced agro-industrial network in the north, and the high-tech, export-driven gateway in the south.
But we have to confront the reality of this situation.
Yeah, we have talked extensively about cold storage, automated weaving, biotech labs, and refrigerated trains. All of that is just hardware.
And hardware is useless if the operating system is corrupted.
Exactly the analogy I was thinking of. You can buy the most advanced, expensive smartphone on the market, but if you try to run an unstable, virus-laden operating system from 2 decades ago, the hardware will inevitably crash.
The source is extremely blunt regarding the software of industry, the political culture, the administrative habits, and the social contract of the region.
The roadmap asserts that the regional operating system must undergo a fundamental, painful upgrade, or the entire physical blueprint will fail.
Looking impartially at the source's critique, what are the specific cultural and political roadblocks that must be dismantled?
The document identifies a history of intense politicization that paralyzes capital.
First, it argues that the state's political apparatus must permanently abandon the habit of treating private industry and private capital as an inherent threat or an ideological enemy.
The adversarial, suspicious relationship between the government and the entrepreneur has to be dismantled and replaced with aggressive facilitation.
The second major roadblock it highlights is land acquisition. In dense agrarian societies, land is incredibly emotive and historically fraught.
Land acquisition has been an endless, highly politicized, and often legally paralyzing battlefield in the region.
A modern mega-factory cannot spend a decade fighting localized legal injunctions to secure a 500-acre footprint.
The blueprint demands fast, transparent, and completely predictable land allotment within pre-cleared designated industrial zones to insulate investors from that friction.
The third critique focuses on the labor culture. It argues that while workers' rights are essential, labor unions cannot be permitted to act as localized economic veto powers that halt production lines over minor disputes or political maneuvering.
The overarching mandate is a ruthless commitment to the ease of doing business. Global capital is perfectly willing to handle market risk. They understand that products fail and consumer trends change.
What capital absolutely refuses to tolerate is regulatory uncertainty. If tax laws change arbitrarily, or if licenses are delayed for months due to bureaucratic whim, the capital simply flows to a different country.
But the source pushes this critique much deeper than just policy adjustments or streamlining tax forms. It demands a profound ideological pivot in the core culture of the state.
It makes a statement that completely redefines the political narrative. Welfare without production is poverty management.
That is the philosophical anchor of the entire document. Welfare without production is poverty management. It is a devastating critique of an economic model that relies purely on subsidies.
Let's really unpack that. It suggests that a government that simply taxes a shrinking pool of wealth to hand out basic survival subsidies isn't actually curing the economic sickness.
It is merely managing the symptoms of the decline. It keeps people alive, but it keeps them trapped.
The roadmap insists that the political culture must aggressively shift its primary focus from wealth redistribution to wealth production.
The argument is that creating mass, high-quality, aspirational employment through rigorous industrialization is, in fact, the absolute highest form of social welfare a government can provide.
That is a total reframing of what it means to serve the public good.
Under this logic, fighting to secure the land and capital to build a massive dedicated refrigerated train line isn't just an act of corporate logistics.
It is a profound act of social welfare. It creates tens of thousands of sustainable jobs across the supply chain, saves millions of farmers from the brink of bankruptcy,
and injects dignity and upward mobility into a youth demographic that would otherwise be dependent on state handouts.
The social contract itself has to be rewritten. The public must view private sector growth and logistical efficiency as the engines of their own liberation, rather than viewing them with suspicion.
Without that ideological software upgrade, the hardware of the factories will never be built.
This has been an absolutely massive, sprawling journey.
We have moved from the microscopic bacterial life necessary to heal a handful of dirt to the thermodynamic challenges of maintaining temperature gauges on a freight train, all the way to the geopolitical maneuvering required to position a deep-water port on the global stage.
It is a phenomenal exercise in systems thinking. It forces us to view a regional economy not as a collection of isolated statistics, but as a living, breathing ecosystem where a change in the urban waste management policy directly impact the export value of a pineapple thousands of miles away.
And why should you, the listener, care about the logistical intricacies of Bengal's cold chain, especially if you live on the opposite side of the planet?
You should care because this blueprint is a universal masterclass in systemic problem solving.
It demonstrates that true, world-changing innovation rarely looks like a lone genius inventing a magical new technology out of thin air.
Real innovation is looking at ancient, seemingly mundane systems like dirt, urban trash, or a freight train, and figuring out the exact mechanics required to connect them in a novel way to the unforgiving demands of the global market.
It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that logistics is destiny. If you can move it predictably, you can monetize it globally.
And if we look back at the deepest, most foundational layer of this entire grand strategy, it leaves us with a concept that fundamentally alters how we view our own environment.
We discussed how, under this new economic model, the biological health of the soil can be aggressively monetized through global carbon credits.
The literal dirt transforms into a measurable, highly liquid capital asset on the balance sheet of the state.
The soil index.
Consider the implications of that. If that is the future trajectory of global economics, how might that radically change the way we value the ground in our own cities and neighborhoods?
Could we be approaching a near future where every municipality, every local government tracks a localized soil health index with the exact same frantic obsession and financial scrutiny as they currently track the daily fluctuations of the stock market?
Because if the logic of this blueprint holds true, the microscopic health of the dirt beneath our feet isn't just an environmental concern.
It is the ultimate leading indicator of our future economic survival.
So the next time you hear a politician point to a shiny new tech park with glass facades and steel beams as the ultimate proof of economic progress, remember the complexity of what we've unpacked today.
Sometimes the real solution, the systemic rewiring that actually saves an economy, doesn't start in the skyline. It starts in the murky, complex, living biology of the dirt.
It truly has to be rebuilt from the ground up.